Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a fascinating, a really specific moment in Taiwan that has triggered a full-blown constitutional crisis.
It's one of those events that just rips the cover off the whole system. You suddenly see all the gears grinding against each other.
Absolutely. We're talking about something that happened in December of 2025. The premier, Zhu Rontai, did something completely unprecedented. He announced a refusal to countersign a law passed by the legislature.
Which is a huge deal. It effectively freezes a law passed by Parliament in its tracks.
Exactly. And that's our focus for this deep dive. We're not getting into the politics of the law itself, the fiscal allocation law.
Right, we're not picking sides. We're using this event as a lens to look at three really deep structural problems: a gap in the Constitution, the insane political costs of their checks and balances, and how misinformation just makes everything worse.
So if you want to understand how a modern democracy can just get stuck, this is the story for you. Okay, so let's start with that constitutional flaw. Where does the premier even get the legal basis to think he can refuse to sign a law? It sounds like the cabinet is just overriding the parliament.
It sounds like it, and that's the heart of the debate. The leverage comes from a really technical bit of text, Article 37 of their Constitution.
Oh, what does that say?
It basically says that for a law to be official, the president has to announce it, but it needs the premier's countersignature.
Okay, so that sounds pretty standard, almost like a two-key system to launch something, procedural check.
It is. But here's the gap, the silence that created this whole crisis. The article says you need the signature, but it doesn't actually say the premier has to give it.
Wait, what?
Yeah. There's no language that puts him under an absolute mandatory duty to sign any law the legislature passes.
So he must sign for it to become law, but nothing says he has to sign. Why on earth would they write it that way? Was that just a massive oversight?
That's the big question. Critics would say it's an oversight, or maybe it was based on an assumption that, a premier would only use this in the most extreme, catastrophic circumstances.
A last resort emergency brake.
Exactly, but the Constitution gives no remedy. It doesn't say what happens if he just says no.
And that ambiguity is what gives the executive branch the room to basically obstruct the legislature.
It's a huge problem for the separation of powers. I mean, Article 62 says the legislative yuan's power is independent. But if the premier can block a law using this technicality, he's basically turned a signature into a veto.
A veto that can't be overridden.
That's the key. There's no process for the legislature to say, okay, we hear you, but we're doing it anyway. He's created this powerful unilateral stopgap.
Okay, so that's the constitutional vacuum.
Right.
But the system has to have a weapon against that. Right? If the premier is just stonewalling the majority, surely the legislature can fight back.
It does. And this brings us to the next layer of the problem, what we're calling the political paradox. The legislature has a nuclear option.
The no confidence motion.
No confidence motion. It's designed specifically for moments like this to force what they call responsible politics.
And how does that work? Just as a refresher.
If the legislature passes a no confidence vote, one of two things has to happen. Either the entire cabinet resigns, or the president dissolves the entire legislature and calls a snap election.
That sounds incredibly powerful. So why aren't they using it? The opposition had the majority. They're claiming their power is being stomped on. Why not pull the trigger?
Because the political cost is just paralyzing. Think about it. To use your ultimate weapon against the premier.
You have to point it at yourself at the same time.
Exactly. Every single legislator, including the ones who started the motion, gets forced into a sudden, expensive, and risky re-election campaign.
So to hold one person accountable, hundreds of politicians have to put their own careers and resources on the line. That's a massive disincentive.
It's huge. And it gets even worse when you factor in that the opposition parties are almost always at a resourceless advantage. A snap election takes money, organization, media access.
Things the ruling party usually has more of.
Precisely. So for an individual opposition lawmaker, the calculation is brutal. The risk of losing your own seat in a rushed election is just too high. It makes the check and balance system, effectively unusable when you need it most.
And that fear is directly connected to the media environment, right? This is where the information asymmetry comes in. They're afraid of a snap election because they know the public conversation is already being skewed.
That's the perfect link. Let's use the fiscal allocation law itself as an example. The media narrative that took hold was that this new law would actually hurt certain local governments.
I remember this. The not increasing but decreasing claim. It was everywhere.
A very potent, very simple, and very misleading claim.
So let's debunk it. What were the actual numbers here?
You just have to look at the size of the pie. The one core fact that was conveniently ignored in most of the reporting was that the total pot of money, the ordinary allocation tax fund pool, was set to nearly double under this new law.
Double. Let's use the actual figures. We're talking new Taiwan dollars.
Yep. The sources show the total pool was going to go from roughly 460 billion TWD to somewhere between 840 and 880 billion TWD.
Wow. Okay, so wait. If the total amount of money nearly doubles, for any single county to actually get less cash, its share of the pie would have to be cut by, what, more than half?
More than 50%, correct. And that just wasn't happening. Even if a county's percentage share dropped a tiny bit, the massive increase in the total pool meant their absolute dollar amount still went way, way up.
So the misleading narrative focused on relative percentages. Your share is shrinking.
Yeah.
While completely ignoring the absolute reality that the pie itself had exploded in size.
Exactly. It's a classic case of misdirection. And when that kind of misinformation gets amplified by those with more resources and friendly media channels, the opposition just can't compete. They can't get the real complex facts out to the public effectively.
Which brings it all back around. They're scared to call a no-confidence vote because they know they'll be fighting the election on a battlefield that's already been shaped by misleading information.
It's a vicious cycle. The check fails because the cost is too high, and the cost is too high because the information environment is broken.
So if the political path is blocked, the logical next step in any functioning system would be the courts. This seems like a perfect issue for the Grand Justice's Taiwan's Constitutional Court to step in and resolve.
It's precisely what they exist for, to fill in these normative gaps and say, this is what the Constitution means. So the big question is, why has nobody asked them?
Let's start with the executive yuan, with the premier. Why wouldn't they want a ruling that confirms their right?
It's a strategic risk. They publicly argue their action is constitutional. But if they go to the court and lose, that ruling could permanently strip future executive branches of this power.
So they'd rather live with the political ambiguity than risk a clear legal loss that ties their hands forever.
Right. They prefer to fight it out politically.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the opposition? They're the ones being blocked. Shouldn't they be banging on the court's door for help?
You'd think so, but they have their own set of calculations. First, a court review is slow. It can take 6 months, maybe more. All the political momentum they have right now, gone.
The news cycle moves on.
Right. But the bigger fear is something called judicial humility.
Judicial humility? What do you mean?
They're afraid the court, seeing how politically explosive this is, will try to split the baby. They might issue a very cautious, principle-based ruling that doesn't actually declare anyone right or wrong.
Like what?
Something like, the two branches must engage in good faith consultation, or both sides should exercise political restraint. You know, a non-ruling ruling.
A clear victory for nobody.
Exactly. And for the opposition, that's a disaster. It kills their strong political story that they are the victims of an unconstitutional power grab without giving them any real win. They figure it's safer to keep fighting in the political arena than to risk an ambiguous legal defeat.
Which leads to our final and maybe deepest problem. Even if the court did rule, there's a huge crisis of trust in the judiciary itself. Many people just wouldn't believe the ruling was impartial.
Yes, and this is a structural issue. It really comes from two places. The first is the nomination process.
The president nominates the Grand Justices.
Right. So no matter how qualified the person is, there's an immediate public perception that they'll be loyal to the political party that put them there.
The appearance of bias is just baked into the system.
It is. And the second factor is just the nature of constitutional law. When you're interpreting big ideas like proportionality or public interest, there's no single right answer. It's not math. It involves subjective value judgments.
So when a ruling on a hot-button issue happens to align with the values of the party that appointed the judges,
it just fuels suspicion, even if the legal reasoning behind it is perfectly sound.
And the dense technical language of the rulings doesn't help. Most people don't read them, they just hear the outcome.
And that vacuum is filled by political spin. So the one institution that's supposed to be the final, neutral arbiter is itself viewed with deep suspicion, which means it can't really solve the crisis.
What a mess. Okay, so to recap this entire structural breakdown, you have an ambiguous line in the Constitution, Article 37, that opens the door for a standoff. Then, the primary tool to resolve it, the no-confidence vote, is basically too politically costly to use.
And that whole paralysis is supercharged by a media environment full of misinformation, like that whole $460 versus $870 billion distortion we talked about.
The system incentivizes deadlock.
It really does. And the solutions are all huge foundational things. You could try to amend the Constitution, reform the courts, or find a way to make the media more transparent. None of those are easy fixes.
It's clear the system's just completely stuck. So that leaves me with a final thought for you to take with you. Given this reality, a media landscape that's deeply polarized, and a public that is, for understandable reasons, suspicious of its highest court, What practical, maybe even non-political solution could possibly fill this constitutional gap and get the gears of government turning again? Something to think about until our next deep dive.